Welcome to Podcast Done For You, the show where we make it as easy as possible for you to make the right choices to advance your podcasting career. So let's get started on the show. Hey, welcome everyone to Podcast Done For You. And in this episode, we're specifically going to look at the idea of video versus audio. Now, I want you to take a think about this in a very different way. Okay, most people gravitate simply towards the idea of video because they think must be on video. But I want you to understand the implications of the decision and whether it is the right decision for you. So let me preface this by saying many of the podcasts that I've produced in the past have been audio only. You may be watching this one on YouTube, and yes, watching it. You can be listening to it on YouTube and listening to it in any other number of places. But whether you're watching it or not, the audio is just as good. And that is just my point. That when you are creating video, the whole idea is that you have to capture people's attention visually. Now, one thing I learned many years ago when I was working in television was that you're only as good as the pictures in front of you. So you have to make a decision. Are you producing this for video, for an audience that's going to be watching, or are you producing it for an audience that's going to be listening? Now, that decision is going to vary depending on your audience and the kind of podcast that you're producing. Now, there was a little phase where people talked about the idea of a vodcast and trying to mix those names and things. These days, it's just all thought of as a podcast. But what I would say to you is that you need to take a step back and think of the implications first before you start making any decisions about which one to use. So what are the implications? Very simply, the editing process for video is a lot harder than an audio-based one. That is, if you want a level of production that means you're not going to skip. For example, if I randomly have a word in the middle of it, supercalifragilistic, for example, if I was to edit that out, you're going to see, because our heads naturally move and because things happen, you're going to see a little jump. Now, no one wants to see that, right? It doesn't look professional. And in fact, I'll let you a little tip that if for those of you that might be new to video production, understand how do you actually edit something if that's the case? Well, if you watch your TV news bulletin tonight, then you will notice that they have a thing called a cutaway. Now, what that cutaway does is allows you to edit things so that you can combine two bits of a sentence, or you can change bits and pieces of what is being said because you have a limited period of time to use. So what is a cutaway? Well, generally a cutaway you'll see in a news sense is often, could be the reporter nodding, could see it from a camera coming from behind and doing that. It's a slightly different angle. Often it's hands. You'll see someone's hands all of a sudden like this, or doing something. It's just allows you to put a different shot in place, and it does it in a way, they do it in a way, I should say, that you're using only one camera. Now, if you've got a setup where you've got multiple cameras, it is a little bit easier to do that editing because you've got the two feeds coming in at one point and you can easily switch from one to the other to show a different angle. And so people accept that it's a different angle for a moment or two, and then you can go back to the main one, and hence your editing. But that's the point, is there's a lot more involved in doing it. When it comes to audio, it's very simple. You just cut it because you're not looking at anyone visually, so you can't tell that there has been an edit that has been taken out. For example, ums and ahs. Unfortunately, we all do that quite naturally. And it's not something that you can take out very easily in a video sense without those jumps and without spending a lot of time doing something creative on there. The other thing too is that if you've got essentially, like this one is, a talking head for 15-20 minutes, it's very difficult to keep that interesting. Now, I'm producing this on video to make a point because occasionally there are going to be some of the podcasts done for you that are going to show some visual elements. But essentially this is a traditional podcast. It happens to be being shown on YouTube, but the point of this particular one is really around the audio most critically. So, what does that mean? What are the implications that if you go for audio only? Well, first of all, as I said, it takes the emphasis off what people are going to be looking at. Now, let's be realistic. When you put a video up on YouTube to watch it, how many of you are not doing something else at the same time? Now, if you're at work, you're probably looking at emails or something else that's coming in and you've got it playing in the background, so you're not even watching it in the first place. I mean, I'm sure many of you do, you sit in front of the TV at night, and so hence a video on screen, but how many people are not doing something else at the same time? Frustrates me, I know, sitting there watching the rest of the family on their phones or reading or doing something else, but that's the nature of the way we operate these days. So often you're going to that effort of producing a video without much real return. You can on YouTube simply have an audio-based only podcast up there. You put a nice still shot of simply of the program, whatever you're going to use, generally speaking, as your graphic for your podcast. That's what you would use, and that's what stays on screen in that time. Now, that doesn't stop you putting some other things in between. You can put some keywords up on screen. You can do some of those basic things like you might do in an accompanying presentation. But again, you have to think of, is that a valuable use of your time to be able to do that? How many people are actually watching? You have to take it on face value and work out what's happening with things. Now, of course, there are going to be some of you that want to produce a podcast that is very visually based, that does want to show tools, that does want to demonstrate things, that is necessary to have things coming up on screen, whether you might be bringing in examples, you might be using browsers, you might be using a presentation. I get it. Those things are really worthwhile doing, and that is a decision that you have to make. But you have to decide that in advance. You also don't have to do exclusively one thing or the other. That's the great thing about the podcasting platform, is that, yes, it is better to be consistent and set some expectations of your audience. So if they go and, for example, the first time they see you is on YouTube and it is a video where there are things happening and they're interested and they subscribe and they go to watch another one and the next one is just a still shot, yes, that does create some inconsistency and they're kind of wondering what's going on here. But it is not a thing that you 100% have to be locked into. You can definitely make some exceptions if you want to do that, if there's a necessary point to do it, but understand the implications of it. So when it comes to audio and video, let me make a few other observations of general life as well. Now, there's an old song that any of you who are children of the 70s and earlier remember this one. Video killed the radio star. And that was the premise of that song, of course, was the basis that video coming in was going to kill things on radio, that we would stop listening and we would only be watching, that the likes of MTV would end the days of music radio. Well, that hasn't happened. It's never going to happen. As someone who's been in and worked in radio for many years myself in the past, it's not a thing that is a reality. In fact, radio only gets stronger all the time because it has some uniqueness. And here's the basic principle that you get to understand when you work in radio versus television. And I mentioned it earlier on, is that simply the video to a degree means you are restricted by the pictures that you have in front of you. So it's a lot harder to talk to things that you cannot show because there's an emphasis being put on the pictures. Now, when it comes to audio-based, you're in control of the pictures that you are creating in people's minds. And that is a very powerful thing. It makes it very relatable. It also means that if people are sitting and listening to it in the background, then there's less emphasis on the pictures. For example, many people will be listening to a podcast while they're out doing exercise, while they're driving, while they're on public transport, and you don't necessarily want to be sitting there watching something. It's not possible in many of those examples. So the audio-based only gives you a lot more flexibility. So again, I understand that there are some times that there is a podcast that needs to be visual, and there's a reason for creating it that way. I've put an emphasis on this one, allowing it to be visual, but it is much simpler. I am telling you right here and now that we're not doing a lot of editing to this podcast. I am simply talking to the particular points that I have in mind from beforehand, but we're not doing edits. You're not going to see lots of cuts. You're not going to see cutaways and various other things. See, even those mistakes that I just made, I'm not going to try and cover those up. I want you to see it raw and natural, but I want you to understand the difference between audio and video when it comes to making your decision about what is right for you. And when it comes to the actual editing software and things that you need to use, that can also be different. There are many platforms that do particularly focus on one versus the other. So that's something to be aware of. Sometimes they do both, and video by nature needs to do audio as well, but the emphasis is more on the visual. And similarly, there are some audio-based platforms that do video, but the emphasis is more on the audio version. So you have to be very conscious of what you're choosing in that, and that's something we may look at in a future episode of Podcasts Done For You. So again, now let's pull back for just a second, take a breath, and say to you, this is part of the issue when it comes to designing your podcast that you want to take out of your hands, okay? You want to do the strategy with someone else that is going to help you understand your audience and make a decision that is an objective decision based on what is really needed, not on one that is your gut instinct. I've had many people come to me and go, oh, I want my podcast to look like that. And that's great, but is it relevant to your audience? And is the level of production that is going to be needed to produce that worthwhile? Don't mistake it. When it comes to video, there is a substantially greater investment in it. Lots of things that you need to consider. Again, we'll look at in future episodes, but just to list off a couple, the quality of the camera that you've got. If you're producing something on video, you probably want to step above a traditional webcam. That's what we're using here today. This is not a traditional webcam. This is a much more expensive camera. And again, I'll be happy to share that with you in future episodes. But you also want to consider the fact that you do need more people involved in the editing process. It is tougher. It does take time. All of these things are going to introduce more costs. You've got lighting to also consider here as well to get the perfect kind of atmosphere. And I can tell you that where you can stick a microphone in the same place every time and get a pretty good sound each time, when it comes to the camera and lighting setup, every time is slightly different. Unless you have a completely blackened room and you can 100% control the lighting all the time and you can have everything seated in the same place every time, then you are going to spend each time on setup. Again, another reason why it is so much easier to do audio. And again, if you have a look at it, where are most podcasts listened to? It's on Spotify and it's on Apple. YouTube-based podcasts are only fairly new. Yes, we've had YouTubers around for some time, but the premise of that is not a podcast. Now, there are many great podcasts that are on YouTube, but let's have a look at them. Many of those ones that you are probably got in your mind right now are ones being produced by people with lots of money behind them. Now, what does that mean? It means that they've got producers, they've got directors, they've got multiple cameras, they've got a dedicated studio set up, they've got people looking after the lights and the microphones and everything. So the personality that is doing the interview is just showing up and doing the interview and bringing the guest along. You also have to consider that hair and makeup can be a thing for some. It's not a case for me, but it is a case for many people that they want to be doing those sorts of things as well. So there are a lot of things to consider when you're doing audio versus video based. My advice, start off with video. My advice is don't start off with video. There you go. A perfect example of me not going to edit that. Or will I? No, we won't. But start off with audio. there's nothing wrong with starting off with your first series of the podcast, focusing on the bit that is going to be the most critical, which is establishing your voice, establishing the credibility, establishing a style. Make it as simple and as easy as possible. Now, one other thing that I want to mention to you at this point is that the whole purpose of why we're here is to give you some advice for you to think about, and I hope we've been able to do that, but also to say to you, hey, throw that out the window. Come talk to us. Podcast done for you, because it is, as the name suggests, we'll do everything for you. We'll work on the strategy. What is actually right for you? What is your audience about? What are you trying to achieve? We'll go through all of those things. We'll make you understand the implications of any of the decisions that you make. And of course, we can do everything for you. We've done podcasts that are fully video based, some of them shot on location, some of them via online and on studio, and we've also done the audio based ones. So we know what we're talking about, and we'll look after all of that for you and make it very transparent in making you understand that there are cost differentiations, and it depends on your audience and what your objectives are. It depends also on the return in investment that you're looking for with anything. Again, we'll go through that in more detail in another episode, but I'd like to say to you this, that all of these things come based on the fact that you want it to take the least amount of time. You don't want to be spending hours and hours and hours of your own time on developing all of this material when you can have someone else do it for you and you just show up as the expert. That is what Podcast Done For You is all about. We'll talk together about audio versus video, work out what's right for you. But as I said before, that if you are watching this video now to try and get your head around how should you think about your podcast? Well, very simply, think about the difference and the implications of video versus audio. There's not a right or wrong answer for everybody, but my advice, as I said before, is start with an audio based only, because it is a lot simpler. All right. I hope that's given you something to think about for this particular subject. It's something we're going to expand on in future episodes, certainly at looking at video cameras, lighting setups, and all of those things will come out. We hope you've enjoyed Podcast Done For You. As I said, Podcast Done For You, the show. Just subscribe below on whatever platform you are watching it on. Please leave a comment and do let us know if there's anything that you want us to look for. And meanwhile, if you're looking at this and thinking, gee, this is just another one of those decisions and another long list of things that I have to think about, come talk to us at Podcast Done For You, the program, because what we will do is make it easy as possible for that to happen for you. So you're podcasting in no time at all without having to worry about watching all of these videos. But we do want you to subscribe anyway. All right. Thank you for joining us. I'm Anthony Pearl. Thank you for watching Podcast Done For You.